Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
And welcome to Classroom Chronicles, a monthly Teachers Talk radio show where we explore the stories and experiences of a range of teachers and others who work with and support our schools. I'm really excited tonight to welcome Becky Allen. Welcome, Becky, and also to check if Becky Allen is here, because I'm a little slow on the text sometimes.
I am indeed, and I hope you can hear me.
I can, so we're all good. Fantastic. Welcome aboard. We have some questions for you today. We're very excited to kind of explore some of our regular themes. So I'll give a bit of preamble, and then we're going to get into our discussion. So on Classroom Chronicles, we're interested in the idea that humans are storytelling animals. So schools are full of people who celebrate and enjoy stories, and we scrutinize the stories that people share and tell. So we always include a little explanation of our guest stories, and that's our third and final section of this evening. We also always try and bring the conversation around from topics and ideas that have been introduced on previous shows. And we're going to kick off in a moment with a few questions linked to ideas that previous guests have shared. And then our main feature, as always, is an area of education or life or tech, in this case, all three of those, that our guest is particularly interested in. So we'll be digging into AI, large language models, and whether they have any place in schools shortly. Before we get there, some questions from last time from Becky Allen. So Becky is Chief Analyst and co-founder of TeacherTap, which is a large teacher survey and development tool, the largest in the UK, of course. She's currently a visiting professor at the University of Brighton and is a former professor of education at UCL, the Institute of Education. Over her academic career, she's written extensively on school accountability, admissions, assessment, expenditure, and teacher careers. And as an economist by training, with experience as a secondary school teacher, she's an expert in analysing large data sets. In 2018, she chaired a government working group to review how data is used in schools. I was lucky enough to be involved in that, and it was a really interesting project with some interesting outcomes. And her book on teacher careers called The Teacher Gap was published in 2018, and her new book, The Next Big Thing in Education, was published in 2021. Becky, did I miss anything?
I don't think you did. I think that was a good summary.
Fantastic. Well, welcome aboard. And our first question actually comes from a previous guest. So a couple of months back, we had Dan Borman on the show, who said homework is unfair and unnecessary if we teach well enough. So I'm going to ask you in 20 seconds time, do you agree? Is he right? Is he wrong? Before we get there, a little word from our sponsors, because of course Teachers Talk Radio is funded and supported by sponsors as well as voluntary hosts like myself. If you're interested in getting involved, do contact us. First message today, we have a newsletter. Have you subscribed to our weekly newsletter as yet? It's called Soundbites and Insights and has over 10,000 educators reading each week. It has a selection of 4 standout shows from the week and then discounts and offers from our sponsors. You can sign up at ttradio.org/newsletter. And as always, John Catt support the show. So the show is supported and brought to us by John Catt Educational, who publish professional development books, including The Next Big Thing in Education. So you can still buy that. They support great teaching and learning in schools around the world, and level up your professional development today by visiting John Catt, which has 2 T's, bookshop.com, to explore the full range of books, which is ever growing. And if you use the code JCTTR2425, you get a 20% off your order. And lastly, the Chalk and Talk podcast is something we're recommending, which if you're looking for another great education podcast or show, then the Chalk and Talk with Anna Stock is certainly worth exploring. So Anna is an advocate for evidence-based maths education for students of all ages. On her podcast, she talks about everything from effective teaching methods to how-to guides for teaching maths to tips for evaluating the pernicious research shows claims that often we're presented with. And she brings on board top-notch guests, educators, researchers, policymakers, and discusses issues that affect and impact teachers and students. So Chalk and Talk is for anyone interested in education, so who may well be listening to this show. Find it on all the main podcast streams. So Becky, thank you for your patience. Homework, unfair, unnecessary, or is that wrong?
Well, I agree with him in three respects. I think that it's unfair. I mean, it's unfair in the sense that it perpetuates inequalities between those who have structures of support at home to complete it well and those that don't. I think I agree with him that it's unnecessary in theory, that time in school should be enough to complete learning if used efficiently. And I think that's something we might come back to talking about, like why isn't schooling efficient, as we talk tonight about AI. I also agree with him in the sense that there's always this argument that people make that you have to have young children doing homework so that they learn how to do it. They learn
Hmm.
how to be self-disciplined. And I absolutely do not buy that argument at all. You know, children are bad at doing homework because they have immature executive function, and they will grow up and their executive function will mature and they will become adults who are capable of, you know, having the self-discipline to do things, the self-regulation to do things in situations where they're not fun, like work. And we don't need them to play at doing that at a time when it's very difficult for them to do it. But there's one way that I really sort of disagree with him. And the place I disagree is in the sense that I think independent learning and practice for students without the substantial input of a teacher is incredibly important in most subjects. And like how important it is and what that looks like varies a lot. But to give an example, you know, maths, we might have something like 5 hours a fortnight of maths teaching going on. But actually, the majority of that time doesn't need to be instruction. There needs to be lots and lots of independent practice. And then the question comes like, where should that be taking place? Should it be taking place at home? Should it be taking place in a room in school that's not a classroom? Or should it be taking place in a classroom with a teacher at the front? And I think that's where it gets tricky. I mean, I noticed, you know, one day my daughter, who's now 14, came home and she was complaining about one of her teachers. And she was complaining about her teacher because her teacher had told them to do 30 minutes of independent work in silence on their own during the lesson. And she said that teacher is just lazy. Well, I mean, of course, you know, kids have all kinds of strange views about their teachers, and that's by the by. But what interests me is how much teachers feel uncomfortable about the idea that they can have a class where they're doing nothing for 30 minutes because the class is working in silence, and the extent to which teachers feel this kind of overwhelming urge to intervene and do something and perform in some way. You know, it sometimes feels unthinkable, for example, that you would have an observed lesson where somebody came to watch your lesson and actually you were doing nothing for half an hour. But such is the nature of learning, in my view, an important part of learning.
And this reminds me of when we explored primer-based schooling, the old schoolroom without the focus on the teacher and the board, where students are working through things at different rates based on what they know so far, which maybe have looked a bit more similar to that 30 minutes of quiet work. I don't know. Maybe it's just an
Yes, and
interesting.
it's maybe something that will be relevant to come back to in the sense that, you know, technology is changing what's possible. I know now, for example, that if my daughter's maths teacher is away and there's a supply teacher, there's no work set. They'll be sitting on Sparks Learning, Sparks Maths for a lesson, and they'll just be working away on it all independently, doing whatever it is that's been set for them on there. So that's maybe a re-emergence of
Yeah.
what education very much looked like, you know, 100 years plus ago. You know, so
So
we've been through quite a short period actually of this collective instruction taking
yes.
place.
So let's revisit that a bit later on. And we've got a couple more questions just to kind of get us thinking and link back to those previous shows, which I always share each month as well. So you can always check these out if you're particularly interested. We had Neil Gilbride on a few months ago, and he thought that, well, he's recently written a book on self-efficacy. So um, this premise that it's important to think about students and whether they learn that they can achieve a particular standard in a particular domain with effort. And if they learn that they can do that, that's an important factor in then what they later go on to do. Is self-efficacy a helpful frame of reference for a teacher? Do you think that's worth exploring further, or is there another idea or theme that you think is maybe more significant?
I'm sympathetic to it. And in part, I'm sympathetic to it because, on a personal level, it aligns with the most successful learning experiences I've had in my own life. And whether they were in school or university or the workplace or home, was that always I was able to create a very tight feedback loop between realizing that I was able to get better. And the inputs that were taking place, so that the experience of learning that was very scaffolded. That said, I suppose I'm always a little bit of a skeptic when there's like these proposals to like ask teachers to reorientate the way they're conceptualizing learning in their subject. And we're
Mm,
asking them to do it across all subjects, regardless of what it is. Because I think when we try to put ideas like this into practice, what we would find is that for some subjects, they would find it very easy to take on this idea. They would find it very exciting. They'd find it very useful to fit into their current framework of teaching. And then for other subjects, it would be harder. And it might be harder in situations, I suppose, where it's difficult for a subject to be kind of broken down, compartmentalized, and then like scaffolded without like removing any meaning of the discipline itself. So
are
if
you
you work in those kind of messy subjects, that's where you run into trouble, I
are you
think.
thinking of a particular subject there, or
That, that might find these things
yes,
messy.
yeah,
I like in general, I immediately, because I've taught maths and I've taught economics, I think it's very easy to implement these in these kind of domains. I think
yeah,
it gets harder in domains where you think part of what you're trying to do with students is like difficult to codify. I think that English literature looks a bit like that, where there
mm,
are parts of it that look like that, but it's really hard to kind of create, if you like, mini pieces of work, or in themselves, they have to be assessments because the student has to be able to observe like their attainment and how well they've done. And it's just difficult to scaffold your pieces of work so that the student can experience those improvements within some subjects, I think.
thank you. That's interesting. And you've mentioned their assessment, which I know you're interested in, always have been, and are exploring currently with Matt Evans, who was also one of our guests a
Mm.
couple of months ago. And he mentioned a post that I think you wrote together about formative and summative assessment as categories that get bandied around in schools all the time still, not being very helpful. Can you give us your, this is why they're not helpful?
Yeah, like what makes an assessment summative or formative? Like, is not the format or when it's given, it's the purpose to which it's put. And the argument we make in the blog post is actually like all assessments need to be summative. They need to sum up in some way what is known about the attainment of that student. Otherwise, they're not assessments, they can't be used. And all assessments should be formative. In other words, they should be being used within your school to enact some kind of change or make some kind of decisions. Otherwise, what are they? They serve no purpose. Now, after we blogged this, we had a little bit of pushback, particularly from somebody who, let's just say, they're not in schools every day. And they said, well, that we have these things, they said, within our trust, these big set piece end of year exams, and they're just called summative exams because they don't have any formative purpose at all. They're just the exams. We take them, and then that's the end of the year.
Hmm.
And this led Matt and I to kind of talk quite a lot about these weird end of year exams and the fact that within schools we have these assessments that appear to sort of not really go anywhere. These exams where there's like no consequences for doing well or indeed
Yes.
badly. There's no interventions, there's no corrective teaching. Even if a whole class appears to not know something, nothing happens. And we wondered like how often these actually take place in the schools. We've got a weird name that we call them when we chat between each other. We call them like testination, as in like a test. The test itself is the destination in itself with nowhere to go from there. So we think they're actually quite common in schools, weirdly.
Do you know why? So they're quite common. How has that happened? Because I don't think anyone designs that from scratch. They don't go, let's do this, let's test these kids, and then just do the next thing regardless. How has it come about?
Well, the question is like to me is like, why do you have big set piece end of year assessments? I went through the schooling system a long time ago now, in the late 80s and 90s, in a relatively progressive era and in a progressive school. We never had them. We all just did whatever. And then eventually there were some GCSEs. We didn't have them because essentially we were going through a system that, first of all, like didn't have any kind of accountability, including kind of accountability to governing boards and things like that. So there was no sense in which anyone felt any urge to collect up some data and like tell a board or tell some governors how things were going in departments. It was just kind of the business of the teacher whether they wanted to do tests or not. And some did and some didn't. I also think that at the time, as a school, they weren't thinking that deeply about motivation. And I think these tests do have some positives. And one is that the students then every single year do at least some semblance of some revision of what's been learnt during the year.
Mm.
And in preparation for these exams, because they're motivated to get some good feedback that they're doing okay. And I think that's a great reason to do some exams. And, I'm not against them. I'm interested in the fact that, at least in some subjects, it doesn't appear to matter really how the students do.
So there's loads there, and we could, I think, spend an episode exploring assessment. Maybe get you and Matt on together. That would be an interesting thing for the future. And there's a few ideas you kind of introduced there about tests that happen and then have no end. And then you've mentioned efficiency, and then structures in schools. And we've alluded a bit towards tech, and we're heading towards that, I think, aren't we? Our last non-AI question is a tech question, because I forget the order of the shows, but we spoke to the head teacher of John Wallace School in Ashford, which was one of the first to bring in these smartphone lockable pouches. And cards on the table, I think they're a great thing. Working in a school, I think it's good to reduce students' access to smartphones. Do you think smartphones should be banned, managed, gotten rid of? Is it overhyped concern? Where are you on that?
Well, I think we know from Teacher Tap that we've got to the point now where the majority of secondaries are banning smartphones during the day. In other words, smartphones have to be out of sight at all times, including lunchtime. I'm sure that trend's going to continue, and I'm sure it's absolutely the right decision to be making, not least for a whole load of social reasons. Does that mean, like, in general, therefore, I'm against like teenagers having smartphones? Like, I'm more on the fence about that. There are social benefits as well as costs that I think all parents are navigating. And also the question of technology. My children happen to go to one of these schools where everybody has an iPad.
Yes.
And so they spend their whole time on these iPads that act as their sort of everything devices, from working out what they're doing and where they're going to homework logging, uploading their work after every single lesson. It gets a photograph is taken of it and it's uploaded. And I must admit, when I realized this was happening for my children, I was slightly horrified. But I don't think it matters that much. I
Okay.
think as long as the teachers can manage it, I think that's fine. And there are upsides, and the upsides are just there are always a set of ready devices that can be used anytime a teacher wants to use them, including these things like the teacher's off sick and you want to
Yes.
have some online learning taking place. There's no issues at all with these things happening because it's all set up for it.
I think it's an interesting juxtaposition, because I personally think I probably am. I'm not sure if it's hypocritical, but I have contrasting views on phones in schools, disruptive, happy they're locked away. AI in schools, I'm open to the idea that it could be helpful. I know others would say those two don't match. We were quite obsessed about phones for a while. But let's get on to our main topic. So we're thinking about AI, in particular, large language models, which are everywhere. Will they change what happens in our schools? Do you think?
I think the answer is probably. But I think thinking about it is really complex. And I think when you think about AI, the best thing to do is just start by thinking about learning and thinking about learning in a situation that's not a school, like just some well motivated students wanting to learn something they want to learn, adults in voluntary or work settings. And it gets around a lot of the complexity of what a school is and also compliance and teaching children who don't want to learn things. And I think what's amazing about the situation outside schools is how much of a revolution we've.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Compel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
So I was talking about, the turn of the century, early workplace. We were very much still in the mode of having, if you wanted to learn a new skill as an adult in the workplace, you had face-to-face courses to learn new skills, massively inefficient, wasn't on demand, really variable in quality. And I slowly, whilst I was in the workplace, saw the rise of kind of formal online courses. You just learn things when you need to. And then we saw the rise of free courses and we saw the rise of YouTube. At TeacherTap now, and we're an organization and there's, 13 of us or something, we rarely ever pay for training for employees. When we do, actually, it's usually a mistake. So how do you learn? Well, you go on to spend a day just on YouTube watching bits and pieces. You try to get your head around, like, what's the domain? What is it that you actually want to know? And then you can usually just go in and find a structured course on Coursera and it's all right. The question for me is we've already got there. And so how is AI likely to change that? Well, I think it's going to change it in two ways. And I think both of these are relevant to think about in the context of schooling. And one is just that it makes it much quicker and much cheaper to produce high quality online learning experiences. And this is only going to continue. So when we think about the EdTech players already in the space, providing online learning experiences, homework support, and so on, I would expect to see an acceleration in that kind of space, in the quality of what's being provided. But then there's something happening that is much more than that. Because already I've stopped learning in that way I just described of YouTube and Coursera mixtures. What I do now is I just chat away to ChatGPT about the thing I don't know about. It's quite often a technical thing. I spend loads of time making sure I understand the domain and all the choices and of the things that I'm trying to learn about. Then usually I do go away and I'll watch some YouTubes, but the answer is they're much better pitched at the problem that I've had because I've been able to use ChatGPT to work out the nature of what I don't know.
Can
And then when I've
can you make it a little concrete by telling us the last thing you did that with? I'm sure it's something I will understand, but there's what did you last learn that you didn't know and now you know?
So I'm trying to build, say, some automations to allow business processes to happen automatically. And I want to know what I can do within, say, the Google space. Google have an automation tool called AppScript, what I need to use third-party tools for, what my choices are, and also a load of programming stuff about JavaScript, which is a language I'm not particularly familiar with. So those are the things I'm trying to work out. When I've watched YouTube videos, what I'm then going to do is not go off to Coursera to work on some kind of fake example of a problem that isn't mine and work through it. I will then just come back to ChatGPT and then we will work through the thing bit by bit. It will be teaching me how to do the thing I don't know how to do. It will be live with my questions that I have, my data infrastructure, my real life challenges. And that's very different from doing kind of fake Coursera problems that are quite hard then to apply to your own life. And people might say to all of this, right? I think they might say, is it just solving problems for you? Are you actually learning? And I think the answer is it's partly solving problems for me and I'm not learning, particularly when it comes to like writing code in a language I'm not particularly familiar with. But I'm completely relaxed about that because coding is dead, right? But when it comes to like intellectual thought and understanding about like the structure of the thing I'm trying to build, I'm able to get a really deep handle on exactly how it works, all the choices that I've had, and conceptually what it's doing. And so I believe that that is learning.
So that sounds quite quick as well compared to your
It's
Coursera course.
it supercharges your productivity. And I mean, here's the thing, if you want to use it to help you learn and you are motivated to learn, in my personal opinion, it's brilliant.
So we think it's
And
already there. And then that seems like there's a hanging however, which is then
if
the
you want
school
to
side.
use it to help you avoid learning, it's also brilliant.
Yes. So I keep coming back to Graham Nuttall and it's a bit bleak, but also intriguing take on schools being places that aren't that interested in learning, where students and teachers get into routines and habits and rituals. And then the more I speak to my students about AI, I see them seeing it, or many of them seeing it as a way of getting the work done to make the teacher go away. Is that a relevant take, do you think?
Yeah, it's incredibly relevant because the problem with schooling is that the students may or may not be more or less, motivated to get the work done and to get the work done in a situation where, as discussed before, they've got relatively immature executive function. They live very much in the moment because that is the nature of the brain when you were a child. And so it's very easy to just use the LLMs to produce passable work with minimum effort. And I think we're fairly sure in these situations that, firstly, the teachers are going to struggle somewhat to distinguish between genuine work, genuine understanding of the student, and the AI generated output. The question then becomes kind of, do the teachers care or not? Now, I think when it comes to school teachers, I think they will, not least that at some point they're subject to endpoint exams where the students do actually have to demonstrate they know
Yes.
things. But you get into this performative aspect of schooling that is what Graham Nuttall talks about. The students do things to keep the teachers happy, and the teachers do things to kind of enable peace to take place in everybody's life.
And that might bring
Um,
us round to homework again, possibly, particular, because that's where they have most access, presumably, to AI. And there's this loop. The teacher could be marking it with AI, I guess, as well. Students complete the work, teacher sets it, and at no point is anyone really thinking particularly hard about it. This seems like it's unavoidable for certain types of homework. I don't know if I'm sort of overreaching, but whatever I do within a school, when I set a task, if I'm taking it in and sort of it's got some sort of stakes attached to it, I think I have to be aware now that I can't know for sure whether this is the student's work or not. Do you have any thoughts on how widespread that might be? I don't know whether you've got any teacher tap data or answers, teachers guessing
ooh,
or
I'm
not.
not. I'm not sure we do, and I'm not sure the teachers would know. It's
No,
also really
they'd be
asked to
guessing
ask.
themselves.
It's really hard to ask teachers about things when there's 30 students in the class because at the moment, as things stand, there's a set of kids that haven't, cottoned on to the LLMs yet. There's a set that do know a lot about them, but also understand the nature of learning and are highly motivated not to use them. And I will include, I believe, my daughter in that, who's absolutely clear that she will not use them at any point to help with schoolwork. And then there's a set, who are less focused on thinking ahead to their endpoint exams and productive learning, and they just need to get the homework done so that they can get on with their lives. And it's undoubtedly a problem, and I think that's kind of a slam dunk. I think that's the reason why I would just love that in the state sector we could at the very least keep secondary schools open for an hour at the end of the day so that all independent study was done on site, and then students went home.
So it sounds like a prep type model. So they finish school, they do an hour of that independent work that we see as valuable, and then they go home and they're done. And
Yeah.
that's, yes, okay. And maybe AI can support that as well as be a challenge for it as well. Of course, that's an interesting kind of take, isn't it, as well? So your daughter has a strong, is it an ethical, what's her strong negative response? Because I've been interviewing students at my school, sending out questionnaires. We're thinking about what to do with AI in our school. And I was surprised to see a significant minority of students had really negative views. So I'm interested in whether they resonate with hers as well. Why does she feel so strongly?
Both of my children have very negative views about large language models. I think, they watch YouTube videos and I think they worry about the future. I think they hear my husband and I and our friends talking about what's going on in the world of AI. And obviously, the worries for them, given that they will enter a workplace that will look undoubtedly very different to the workplace that we have now. So, yeah, I think that they have that. I think, my daughter just about understands enough about the nature of learning to understand that it's not good for her to use it
Mm-hmm.
in those situations. Having said that, I'm really happy for her to use it in her academic studies with me supervising and showing her how to use it as a kind of a learning mentor or a tutor in situations where she needs things explained to her. And we have done that, and it works really, really effectively. The problem is that just the kind of the pure large language models chat functions, which don't have any guardrails around them, they haven't been primed to be learning mentors and to support
No.
students. So you can ask them to do it and behave that way quite easily, and it works really well. I mean, I guess in the very near future, we'll get to the point where there's a free or very cheap kind of chat buddy that students can use to get help with their homework that is effective.
So you think that is, given the nature of LLMs and the way they work and what they do and don't do and what they don't know, that's a viable expectation that within X amount of time there will be a tutor that's pretty good?
Yes, I do. And the reason why I think that is that the nature of the British English national curriculum is that it's very well codified. It is out there on the internet in a million different kind of forms, where the nature of the knowledge is out there in a reliable way and in a consistent way. So largely, I think when you ask it for help with questions that you don't know the answers to, it can help you, and it can help you in a useful way. And of course, everybody will say, but maths, it's like fine, but we've already fixed maths. We've got other technology that works for maths, so we don't need to worry about that. But I think for language-based subjects, large language models largely work in the domain of things that kids think about at school.
What about MFL? Because I'm not an MFL teacher. I have a little bit of Spanish and other languages, but it seems, in my understanding of MFL, given that speaking in coherent, grammatically correct manner is one of the aims, it seems ready to go for that. Am I right in thinking that, or have I missed something crucial?
Do you mean like
So
yeah, I think
using this
that's
large
right.
language model, I can chat with it in English and it will speak back to me. They
Yeah.
might not be the most sensible ideas, but they'll be English, and they'll be grammatically correct. And then if my job is to learn Spanish, it seems that is it not ready for me to start speaking Spanish with maybe less prompting, because it's a language learning rather than learning something behind the words themselves.
Yeah, and so I mean, these things are kind of getting there. If you've got a lot of money, you can pay on Duolingo to get the speaking function, which I don't pay for, but I have tried it and I know people who use it, and it's okay. It's reasonably effective now. It will probably be great in 12 months. And relative to the status quo, which we always have to talk about, which is, I studied French for 5 years in school. And at the end of it, I couldn't speak French. And I couldn't speak French actually, because in a French class of 32 kids, none of whom can speak French, it's really difficult to do French speaking practice. So I could get really good at reading French and writing French. But actually, the current environment means it's not really possible to get great at speaking languages in a classroom setting without technology that allows a student to speak in a language to to something else that can support it and speak to it at the right level and correct it and so on.
Thank you. So I think we're going to come back to that. The response to AI reveals a little bit about the nature of what we're doing now and our view of it. And I think we've kind of talked a bit about students and their use of AI and otherwise. If you want to learn something, it's available in lessons or around homework. There's some challenges. And then we've alluded to the fact that children or young people might have strong negative views about AI. That partly you mentioned is due to their future. We've made throwaway statements. Homework is undermined in its traditional form. You mentioned coding in its traditional form is sort of dead. That's we're at a point in our career we can say that and think, oh, that's interesting. It's a very different thing to say to a young person. Can or should schools do anything about that? Like, or what can we do? Because that's a really big deal. The world's become quite uncertain.
And I mean, to be clear, because teachers don't work in workplaces, they may not be aware of what's going on. But to anyone who thinks this is just a fad or that it is not going to radically change the workplace, I can promise you that it already is. When it comes to all white collar jobs, the increase in productivity that is taking place is on a scale that I didn't believe was possible. And it will have disruptive effects, and the disruptive effects will be very different in different industries. And when you have two kids that are 14 and 11, on a personal level, you think deeply about this. You think deeply about their own education and what you can do to kind of safeguard them as much as possible from the risks that are around entering a workplace during a time of significant disruption, which I still think both of them will do. I think the disruption is a 20-year thing, not a 2-year thing, as some mad tech people seem to think. So the question is, I guess, what should they do?
Yes. Yeah. Can you answer
I
that
mean,
as well as set it?
well, on a personal level, I'll tell you what I want for my children, what I think is best. That they just at the moment get as broad an education as possible. That they don't take degrees that are essentially vocational. I wouldn't want them to take a law degree, an accounting degree, anything like that, that leaves them vulnerable to an individual industry that I think is likely to be disrupted. And that in those situations, all that you can do is go and get a good, broad intellectual degree that hopefully will give you a lot of choices and a lot of flexibility about the kind of work that you can do in the workplace. Because I have no doubt there's still loads and loads of humans doing white collar work in the workplace. It's just some specific industries that have become very, very large are going to materially change. And one of them obviously is coding. For a lot of the people who call themselves software engineers, really, they're like the typists of another era, and they are going to start disappearing very quickly.
Do you know, what did the typists go on to do? Do you know? I don't know if I've got a strong grasp of that.
Well, I think that there were new types of admin jobs that were created within the workplace, not least associated with new technologies that were being created around the advent of computers and this thing called email that was very new when I joined the workplace, that started materially changing the nature of work and interactions that were taking place. They were processing things, they were logging kind of things like expenses and stuff like that. So there was all kinds of white collar work that I think they mostly went on to do, but they certainly disappeared. The idea that you had a whole floor of women just sitting there typing away and not thinking intellectually about the nature of the work beyond correcting, minor grammar and spelling mistakes. That was their only kind of intellectual function that they had. All of that went. And at least some software engineer jobs at the moment do look very like that. And that's the stuff that goes. They're just kind of typing code that's been typed before in other contexts.
So when we're thinking about students, we have the big picture, and what I find intriguing and fascinating about the AI space is that there's such disagreement about where it's going, how far it's going to get, whether it's overhyped, whether it's a net positive or negative, and there's lots there. We've thought a bit about students and how they might or might not use it. We've thought a bit about learning, and you've made a couple of statements. So one, I think I'm right in inferring you're saying if you want to learn something, AI is good at helping you with that. You step back outside of school. Is that a reasonable, bit blunt, but I think you've said that. Yes.
Yes, if there's something you don't understand and you want to learn and you're motivated to learn it, it's really good to have a conversation with an AI to learn more
And
about
then
it.
secondly, I think we're going to get to teachers now. We mentioned that some young people, including your children, have strong views about AI, not least because it is world changing. And you're saying that it won't be a 2-year thing, but over 2 decades, there will be significant changes to the employment space, but also the profession's careers and the life course that we take. It reminds me of one of my students who has wanted to be an artist for her. She's in year maybe 11 or 12 now, for a long time, 5-6 years. And she says every time she sees an AI generated image on a poster around the school, she feels really sad and wishes that they'd come to her to ask her to make it. And when she's presented with AI, it's not just an immediate, what might you do with it? It's actually causes this kind of deep existential thought about what's next in her future kind of prospects and career, which is a big thing. And we can't resolve all of that in tonight's discussion, but I think that's something certainly for schools to think about and explore more when we're making our assemblies or predictions about the future. Those throwaway lines really will land with those young people, won't they? It's a big deal.
Yeah.
And then we've kind of hinted at this observation that people's response to AI reflects a lot about their own sense of self, maybe the role they're in, and what they think schools are for. You're much better at wording things than me. Could you word that in a more precise manner, or are we happy with the premise?
Well, I mean, I think we're not just talking about teachers here. We're talking about all
Yes.
different workers, and it's been really fascinating to me to watch people's responses to the existence of AI, because there's a set of people who essentially it's all upside. And I will include myself in that because I'm a director at Teacher Tap. So if we do something more efficiently, or I can save some time so I can go off and have fun by getting my work done in half the time, like it's all good. I also don't feel any kind of threat at all to like my intellectual identity, because actually it's no good at thinking about the things that I think about on the margin that are difficult to think about. So the Substack I write, for example, with Matt Evans, like we are deliberately writing things about assessment that are provocative and different and haven't been written before. And if you try and get like an AI to like edit or help you with the thing you want to write, it will literally like mash up and screw up your argument because it will just be trying to impose the status quo. So, on a personal level, I don't feel any kind of intellectual threat. The people who I think are finding large language models incredibly difficult are not people who are technologically kind of ignorant or not understanding what's going on. Actually, they're often people like software engineers for whom these language models are fundamentally causing them to like question their own intellectual identity. It's frankly pretty scary when you watch a large language model do something that you used to think you were brilliant at. And it turns out they're just as good as you. I mean, to give an example of something I think I'm brilliant at, because I've been doing it now for like since 2017, that's writing teacher survey questions. We have like at Teacher Tap, like thousands and thousands of survey questions that have been written. And I love to go and do training on how to write survey questions because everyone else you do the training for is so bad at it because you
It's really
just
hard.
learn how to write. It's so hard.
And I often only realise this after it's gone out and you go, oh goodness, that's awful.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so they screw them up. And like it makes me feel so good about myself that I have learned how to write good questions. And in 2017, we wrote so many bad questions on Teacher Tap that used to endlessly mess up, right? But I've done that. But it turns out that like if you get large language models to evaluate your survey questions, they are so good. They're so good at tightening up the language of the survey questions. They're so good at like thinking through, are there missing category responses that might be relevant for primary teachers or secondary teachers and so on. It's really very scary kind of how effective
So
they
if your
are.
only job was that, you might have a different view
Yeah.
of AI because your sense of identity, self, creativity, adding value to the world is then you watch the
Yeah.
screen do it in no time or, a few seconds. That's a big thing. Where do you think, actually, it's a bit blunt, isn't it, to ask where teachers are at? But there are a number of teachers who I respect who have a very concerned view about AI and think it doesn't have a place in school. I'm trying to make more sense of that because it's really important. What sense can you make of that response?
Well, I mean, let's just start by saying, like, it doesn't exactly threaten teachers' identity or teachers' livelihood, right? In the sense that, like, we're definitely going to have, like, adults looking after children in these kind of mass settings that allow all the other adults to go on and get
So
on with their lives and allow kids to
that
socialize,
lockdown
right?
insult that we teachers said we don't provide childcare. We do. We do
Of
provide
course.
childcare. So
And socialization. Like,
and
most
face-to-face.
kids like going to
Yes.
school because they want to see their
Okay.
friends.
So there's always a need for children not to be under their parents' feet, and there's this social the benefits that they notice when schools shut. It's not just a flippant, here we are cheap childcare. There's also a kind of function that provides, and anything on a screen doesn't replace that. So you're saying it doesn't threaten livelihoods as such. Is there a but to that?
Well, the but is it could, in some subjects, in some circumstances, threaten the teachers' like autonomy and choice over what they do in the classroom, and also the extent to which they give instruction as opposed to having somebody else doing the instruction for them. I mean, to give like the examples during lockdown, those of us who had primary kids, we saw two versions of White Rose Maths. I don't know whether you remember during lockdown 1, there was essentially no live teaching taking place in the state sector. So we were all given the White Rose Maths videos on Vimeo, and as parents, we would press play, and the White Rose Maths expert would like talk over the video. In the second version of lockdown, we would have the slides, but there'd be a Google Classroom operating. And so instead, we'd hear the classroom teacher like talking over the slides rather than the White Rose expert. And I'll leave you to think about which, on average, was likely to be more effective explanations of things in maths that ultimately have to be explained with incredible precision for the students to like not get really screwed up ideas about what things are. But we can just imagine this kind of question like happening at scale, right? That at the moment, this core part of the thing that the teachers like doing, which is standing at the front and doing the exposition, in some subjects, we will ask ourselves, like, should all teachers be allowed to do that? And how do we decide who's allowed to do that? And what if we could see unambiguously that actually students were capable of making more progress in situations where they were using an online learning tool to work through a curriculum rather than have a real life teacher doing the instruction in the front of the room? Like, do we have a moral duty to think about what happens there? Or is it like the primacy of the right of the teacher, regardless of quality, to deliver explanations, the things that should dominate?
And is there anything you lose with that change? So is there anything about being in a room with an adult who's watching, engaging with my responses that's maybe less tangible, but you don't get from this now log in, could be spoken, could be typed? I'm trying to get my head around that, whether there's a loss there as well.
Maybe, and maybe more in some subjects than others, because of the way that the instruction and response and interaction takes place in some subjects rather than others. And then I will also say, like, we shouldn't assume that
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Kapow Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to kapowprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
don't Don't assume that students will have no relationship or perceived relationship with the computer or the device that is teaching them. I think it's very easy for us to understand the relationship they have with teachers, including the motivational relationship. But we already know from the existence of LLMs and behavior of humans with LLMs that they take on personalities as they get to know you, and they remember things about you, and they can talk to you in a way that makes you feel like, they care about you and they care about your learning, and they're incredibly positive and like goad you on to, keep working hard and so on. So what do we lose? Something, I'm sure. And what do we gain? Something else. And, we have to decide, like, what's the framework for deciding whether this is what we want or not.
I partly wonder whether we lose the teacher's sense of efficacy and pride in I've carefully worked out and set these ideas into order in a way that works quite well. That's an important part of doing a job well, and important, I think, for students to see that. I feel that might be part of the concern about AI, and that it does maybe provide alternatives to that. But I guess I could be wrong about that as well.
I I think you're right, and I wrote a blog post about artisan teaching and what happens if we lose it. And I think it's an open question: who wants to be a teacher in an era
Mm.
where the job starts to look very different?
And what does it do? So I think I've been trying to read as much as I can around AI, and I read Co-Intelligence by, is it Ethan Mollick?
Yeah,
Or yes, and
yeah.
he talks about the fact that it depends what you know before you start using it makes a difference. So experts make certain use of it, novices make a different use of it. And if we're thinking about teachers, teachers now are using it, having taught for a significant period of time, most of them without AI. So you're using it as this kind of back and forth. A
Mm.
teacher training now, presumably, could use it to produce the artifacts of teaching, the lesson plans, the resources, the questions, the quizzes, the plenaries, the pictures. But I know that Peps McRae talks about this as well, that the person doing the thinking gets the learning. So have you any thoughts on what use of AI could do to teachers over time?
I think when we think about novice teachers and the nature of planning that goes on, I think we have to think hard about, like, what are they thinking about, and is it intellectually useful, and how much of the time is intellectually useful.
Mm.
I do remember what it was like to be a new teacher, and I think a lot of the time that you spend doing planning actually isn't thinking intellectually about the nature of how to learn a subject and how to learn new ideas. A lot of it is spent just doing all that stuff of trying to work out the worksheet activities and the keywords and so on. So I wouldn't like automatically say that the teachers are not going to think if they are using LLMs to streamline planning, even as a novice teacher. I would see that as an empirical question. And it's an empirical question that it's very easy to put to a test through experiments where we could randomize new teachers into different groups and ask them to plan in different ways. We can get some intermediary measures of, like, what do they know going into the classroom to teach. We can do some observations of how they teach under different circumstances. And we can even look at learning gains for the students. So it's easy for us to just make these arguments that it's good or bad, right? But ultimately,
So that's one
there
to
will be a
test,
set. Yeah, it's one to test. There's going to be a set of trade-offs. And I don't think we should always assume that time spent thinking is good.
because it could be
Because
time
lots,
spent panicking, trying to find things, couldn't it? Like, well, what am I going to teach? Where can I find
yeah,
it?
or just like formatting your worksheets and all the other
Yes.
nonsense that goes on. Like,
Okay.
a lot of it isn't thinking that is going to help you teach and give good explanations during class.
So what I find interesting at the moment is that there is government advice for our schools to explore AI because it has great potential for teachers and possibly for students as well. And I haven't read it all. There was more released, I think, just 2 weeks ago. It seems to hedge its bets a little on specifically what is good uses and bad uses. It's obviously very clear on kind of safeguarding concerns and ethics and GDPR. Has a few throwaway
Mm.
lines. So, for example, you may be breaching copyright law if you use a student's answer with an LLM, even without their personal data within, because it's their own creative piece of work. Hasn't
Yeah.
said for sure whether that's the case. What what can and should schools be thinking about and doing now? Should we just wait for a bit, do you think? Or are there things that we can sort of start playing with now?
Well, I think it's rather like the workplace. If you turn around and tell teachers they shouldn't be doing things that ultimately are going to massively improve the efficiency of their time at home, unpaid, doing preparatory work, writing reports and other things, they're going to do it anyway. The same way that in every single workplace at the moment where they've banned LLMs, they're all being used and they're all being used on personal devices. So I don't think the kind of stick your head in the sand and do nothing is a viable response. I think a lot of it is about being realistic about like the nature of how things are at the moment. You know, people worry about it being used for communication and report writing, and it's like, well, guys, over 20 years ago, when I was a teacher, we would write 30 school reports in 30 minutes, and we'd do it by like setting up an Excel spreadsheet with some like statements on it, typing the
Mm.
numbers in for the kids, and compile it all. Like, let's be realistic about like what is the status quo and what's happening, and therefore, what is it that we're doing to disrupt it. When it comes to like lesson planning, you know, the idea that this is like some fully artisan approach at the moment where teachers are thinking deeply and intellectually from first principles and putting together optimal resources, it's like the reality is there isn't time to do that for every lesson. A lot of the time they're just finding whatever it is they can find and hacking it together either coherently or incoherently, you know, to just get through to the next lesson. So I don't think we have to kind of pretend that we're living in this like beautiful world where everything is working brilliantly for teachers in the way that they are doing this artisan job of being this wonderful teacher, and therefore anything that disrupts it is risky. I think we're already in a very compromised world because of the workload that we place on teachers and the
Mm.
vast number of teaching hours that they have, and therefore we have to be realistic that they need help
So
to
if it's
do
buying
things.
time, it's helping
If
them
it's buying
produce
time,
resources that are well formatted. There's
yeah,
those bits of job. Okay.
getting
What
marking done.
Yes, yes, and I feel that maybe a revisit when we look at assessment and maybe the AI aspects of market would be really interesting because I think there's a lot of debate about what it can and can't do,
Mm.
premised upon understandings of reliability. I know a number of humanities teachers will tell me it's not very good at marking essays because it doesn't agree with them, and it might not be very good at marking essays, but we also know that humans aren't great at that either. So
That's
it's an
right. And they
it's
may
an
not,
interesting
they
area.
just may not have bothered to write a rubric or got the LLM to help them write a rubric that
Yes.
allows the marking to take place.
Okay. What about students? So, hypothetically, say one of us was a school leader and we're looking at the
Mm.
extent to which we give students access deliberately to AI. So, I know Gemini, for example, has Gemini for teens, and
Mm.
you can be, if your school uses that, obviously other providers are available, Microsoft and GPT, different restrictions. Is do you think the same or different approach? Because it's not, there's obviously a substantive difference between teachers using it to plan and students having it there and available.
Yeah, I mean, I largely think at the moment it's going to be difficult for teachers to allow it to be used during lessons in a way that is helpful and is
Mm.
genuinely going to support learning as opposed to get work done.
So you'd
So
want a strong use case, wouldn't you? Go, if we, why have this available? What is it the student can do that you can do that's going to be helpful? Because otherwise, it's just a possible answer to the question, presumably, at any given moment.
sure,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. So we've explored a lot, and I think there's lots of things that listeners might want to follow up with questions, or comments of future show, or you can interact with us via Twitter or other platforms. I'm going to say what I think we've covered, and then you can tell me which key bits I've missed, and then we're pretty much there because I know dinner's calling, isn't it, for both of us? I imagine. So
Actually, I've already had mine, but
have
yeah,
you? Oh, I
yeah.
feel cheated. I waited. So, okay. So we've gone AI. It is kind of pernicious. We think the premise of the effect it will have upon school, and we later on talked about the impact upon society, is maybe to step back and say, what is it good for? And you're stating it's good for learning if you want to learn something. Had the example of the workplace, that your own workplace.
Mm,
And is that solving problems? Well, yes. Is it helping you learn? You're saying it does help me solve problems. And some of the things you're not learning, coding,
mm,
not needed because of what it can do. It's an interesting thing. We then alluded to well, what is the impact for others? So we've mentioned, or you explored, the fact that the white collar workspace will change. You don't think quite as quickly as some of the hype is saying, but over the next 2 decades, professions that are very clearly defined involve tasks that maybe it can do the ones who have more downsides than upsides with AI at the moment. So law, accountancy, and other specific white collar roles might be very different in 20 years' time. And we started to think about, we didn't get a huge distance because there's so much. We started to think about, as a school, what can we do about that? And giving people as broad and balanced an education as possible is more important than ever. We then briefly started to explore teachers have very strong responses, positive, negative, uncertain to AI. And we think that partly links to the way that one perceives the role and the classroom and the risks that it represents. And then we were exploring what we think schools can and should do now. And I'm getting advice. I always try and get advice from guests. So your advice on AI for teachers is it's out, and maybe managing it and being open to that is important. So if we can't put that one back in the box fully, but maybe bringing it into the light and seeing what people are doing, helpful, unhelpful, would be useful. AI for students, if we're providing that to students, we'd need to have a use case as to why it's worth doing, because of that, the Graham Nuttall problem. They just want to get the work done. So maybe there's a hole, and actually brings us back to your initial concerns about your children's school where there's iPads. For me, it's not just AI, it's tech in general. When there's a screen there, whether they're Googling the answer or Geminiing the answer is a bit of a red herring. There's something there. Have I missed anything?
I don't think you have.
So any last comments? AI in education, anything you think that we should cover, explore this issue more, or research is needed more here? What have we got to kind of finish things off? What do we need to find out more about over the next few years?
Well, I think I would say we all need to spend a lot of time thinking about what learning is, what learning in the classroom is, whether we've got our models of what learning looks like kind of right. And the reason why I think that's important is just that whenever we think about the future and technology that's changing apace, I just think we have to be realistic about the status quo and the effectiveness of the status quo when thinking about can we do better than it.
And it sounds like you're suggesting there's some quantitative research that we could do there to really work these things out. We do have a question, which is always great to invite. So we're, Cassie, I'm going to click a button that may, I think, allow you to ask a question, if you're still there. So I've hit a yes to that. Let's see. Give her a moment. I may be very slow in responding to that request. Oh yes, welcome. Cassie, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I'm sorry, and I'm joining very late, and I'm in the middle of some of these conversations with other people. But one of the things that strikes me now, I was raised by a British family in Canada, so I'm very partial to Britain, and enjoy hearing that you're speaking in a context. But what strikes me about the whole conversation is you're kind of speaking as if the classroom is uniform, the students are uniform, and we're talking about what's the application of this AI and how is it going to go. Whereas it strikes me that I'm kind of speaking up for. I know I grew up. I know, basically, I don't know, sort of traumatized Irish or whatever, bitterness between the culture, how you deal with people you get. And somebody said, how are these people? They think that they're learning about these injustices because people are reading. No, they're not learning about it because they're reading. It's because some people in society seem to be very much more important. And when you're trying to deal with normal things in society, you find yourself being, put on hold, put on hold, put on hold. You never, and then you kind of have to get their courage up somehow, even when nobody's ever paid attention to you before. I speak on that just because I'm used to it. I raised my disabled brother by myself. I also learned from Black American culture to actually do that, to raise by themselves. There's different cultures around the world with different experiences, even with talking with the teacher.
So
And so I guess that's where I just want to throw that in as how, the personal thing will be added. It's not just personal, but how tutors are added in to, to interface with the AI. I'm sure that AI is very useful, but, when it's given as the main solution to
yes,
people who are, there you go. Thank you.
yes, I think, thank you though. So we have to think about the problem that it's solving. And I think there may be, just like in the workplace where it can be used to learn something we're motivated to learn, presumably, whether we're in the classroom or not, young people and older people will be using that increasingly to find out more about things they want to learn about as well. So I think that's really helpful to consider. Thank you very much. Becky, thank you again for giving your time on a warm June evening to discuss pedagogical issues and AI. because I know you find it fascinating, and I know it's probably been quite a long day as well. So thank you. We're really grateful. Thank you very much indeed. If people want to read more or engage with you further about this, where and how can they do that?
Okay, I'm on most of the social media platforms as Prof. Becky Allen. I have a blog which is at rebeccaallen.co.uk. I have a Substack which is called 100% Assessment with Matt Evans. You can find me on the TeachTap website if you want to get in touch. My email address is there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And I think we'll be following up on that suggestion. I think it was mine. I made the suggestion myself of maybe a follow-up around assessment and all things tech over the next year or so. But
Lovely.
thanks again. Thank you to our listeners. Hope you found the discussion stimulating and thought-provoking. Do, as always, get in touch and let us know if you've got further questions or suggestions for future guests or directions that the show can take. Have a wonderful Wednesday evening all, and we'll be back on the 23rd of July with Kate Finlayson, and we're going to be exploring homeschooling, because she's both an experienced homeschooler and does a huge amount of supporting others in that space. I'm looking forward to that very much. Thank you all, and good night.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.